Prejudice against color was rebellion against God. Of all men beneath the sky, the slaves, because most neglected and despised, were nearest and dearest to his great heart. Those ministers who defended slavery from the Bible were of their father the devil, and those churches which fellowshipped slaveholders as Christians were synagogues of Satan, and our nation was a nation of liars. When discovering this quote by Frederick Douglass in his autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom, during my extensive research on him, I felt it perfectly encompassed his view on slavery along with what he had dedicated his life to fighting, especially having experienced the devastation and anguish of slavery firsthand. Frederick Douglass was born as Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey into slavery in February of 1817 in Talbot County, Maryland. He was born to Harriet Bailey, an enslaved black woman. His father was an unknown, undocumented white man. From birth, he was separated from his mother and lived with other slave children who had been separated from their parents, all who were underfed and underdressed. He worked for Captain Aaron Anthony. At 7 years old, he was passed to Mr. and Mrs. Hugh Auld, who lived in Baltimore. Mrs. Auld, who was a Northerner, taught Douglass how to read and write, but Hugh stopped her because he saw the passion that it stirred within Douglass. His first taste of education inspired a desire within him, and he secretly continued to learn how to read and write. He augmented this secret education with the assistance of white children he met on the street and by the docks. Eventually, Captain Anthony passed away, and then Douglass became the property of Anthony's brother, Thomas. Douglass was then contracted out to a professional slave breaker because he did not prove to suit Thomas's purpose, according to onlineliterature.com. In the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, he describes his experience. Mr. Covey succeeded in breaking me. I was broken in body, soul, and spirit. My natural elasticity was crushed. My intellect languished. The disposition to read departed. The cheerful spark that lingered about my eye died. The dark night of slavery closed in upon me, and behold, a man transformed into a brute. He returned to the Alds and went to work at a shipyard. There, he borrowed a sailor's papers and assumed his identity. He escaped to New York. He was filled with distrust for the citizens of New York, but was assisted and settled in New Bedford, Massachusetts, under the name of Frederick Douglass, after marrying a free black woman named Anna Marie. New Bedford, Massachusetts was the birthplace of Frederick Douglass as the impassioned abolitionist orator known today. Douglass joined the abolitionist movement in the North after escaping. He became a strong and highly respected voice for the people. After faithfully attending the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society's meetings, he was approached by William C. Coffin to give a speech about his life. He was received extremely well and was then hired to give lectures, and this was the beginning of his career as a public orator. Douglass continued to publish 3 autobiographies: The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass in 1845, and My Bondage and My Freedom, which was further expanded into the life and times of Frederick Douglass in 1881. After writing the narrative, he fled to Britain out of fear of being re-enslaved, but continued speaking on the abolition. In 1847, he returned to Rochester, New York, and started the North Star, a newspaper. It focused on calling for the end of slavery and other abolitionist agenda-inspired pieces. Once the Civil War began, he recruited African Americans to fight at the request of President Abraham Lincoln. He also met with President Lincoln to negotiate the change in the poor conditions provided for the black soldiers. After the end of the Civil War, he started another newspaper called the New National Era with his sons to address the issues that arose in the Reconstruction era, which were continued racism and the attempt to overturn the slaves' emancipation. Douglass's professional career continued up until right before he died because he lived for his passion. Douglass was appointed to the post of the U.S. Marshal for the District of Columbia by President Rutherford B. Hayes in 1877. He held several different positions in office until 1893, which was 2 years before his death. On February 20th, 1895, Frederick Douglass's life came to an end, but his legacy and his message did not. He passed away in Washington, D.C. of a stroke or a heart attack. But what we remember today are his communication skills that lent power to his many speeches. His strongest communication skill was his ability to connect with his audience, a natural talent that had been displayed since his first speech in the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. He also had an exceptional mastery of logos, ethos, and pathos. He employed ethos through the simple fact that he was born and grew up in slavery, yet was extremely educated and intellectual. This appealed to both the blacks and whites in his audience. Pathos was demonstrated through his manipulative language, especially when describing the atrocities of slavery, which helped him to successfully call his audience to action. His logos held firm in the illogic of slavery, and he put it forward in every single speech he gave, trying to tug it in at the intelligence and logic of his audience to understand the lack of logic in slavery. His passion for the end of slavery was within itself a communication skill as well. His speeches were always genuine, energetic, and ardent, which always touched the audience to the core. One of his strongest demonstrations of his passion was through his speech, The Hypocrisy of American Slavery. He gave his speech during the peak of the slavery era when tensions were high and patience was short. He gave this speech at a 4th of July celebration in 1852, which was located in New York, a free state, but he was disgusted with the nation as a whole. Douglas focused on the irony and illogical celebration of the 4th of July. He latched onto the idea that America as a whole was celebrating freedom, while thousands were still enslaved, lacking all freedom in general. He is quoted, "I say with a sad sense of disparity between us, I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence, bequeathed by your father, shared by you, not by me." In this, he outright pointed out the irony of rejoicing and how it is not equally shared, and continued on to compare it to death in the cause of mourning. He also pointed out the blatant hypocrisy of the laws enforced between the blacks and the whites. He is quoted, "There are 72 crimes in the state of Virginia, which, if committed by a black man, no matter how ignorant he be, subject him to the punishment of death, while only 2 of the same crimes will subject a white man to punishment." In this, he is appealing to the lack of logic behind the law that the skin tone is more important than the crime that is committed. He is also pointing out that the slave is a man as well with a sense of self and responsibility. If someone can be held punishable for crimes, they need to comprehend morality and understand what they did was wrong in order to be rightfully punished. Douglas viewed irony as the necessary way of getting his point across, largely and mainly utilizing logos throughout his speech. He is quoted, "At a time like this, scorching irony, not convincing argument, is needed." Douglas continued and utilized his history as a slave for a viewpoint of experience. He was asked to speak by the whites, so he was already respected, so he did not necessarily have to attempt to build up strong ethos. Because blacks were not allowed at these types of communal celebrations or activities, he was only appealing to the crowd of white people. Douglas also employs pathos through the use of visual language, drawing upon their feeling of freedom compared to the slaves' feelings of despair. He is quoted, "Fellow citizens, above your national tumultuous joy, I hear the mournful wails of millions, whose chains, heavy and grievous yesterday, are today rendered more intolerable by the jubilant shouts that reach them." In this, he purposely creates touching and unforgettable visuals through his comparisons, especially between the current state of slaves to the celebratory free American citizens. Douglas ends his speech with, "Go, search where you will. Roam through all the monarchies and despotisms of the old world. Through South America, search out every abuse, and when you find the last, lay your facts by the side of the everyday practices of this nation, and you will say with me, for revolting barbarity and shameless hypocrisy, America reigns without a rival." This final statement is meant to leave a resonating feeling of guilt and shame when the 4th of July is supposed to be celebrating the land of the free and the home of the brave. Once more, Douglas employs logos through irony and pathos through the strong feelings of shame on a day marked by pride. Douglas's life experiences all contributed to his profound rhetorical oratory skills that he is still known for and respected for today. From a childhood in slavery to a manhood as a free man, Douglas dedicated his entire life to the freedom and equality of others. Although he gave many speeches in his lifetime, I personally believe that the hypocrisy of American slavery perfectly exemplifies his skills and passions that changed the course of history.